Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. Today I am doing my picks for the final week of the 2023 regular season. Potentially the final regular season week of the Overwatch League ever. So, bit of a bittersweet, sad moment here. Only 6 games this weekend in the Western region. There are some games in the Eastern region, of course, with the knockouts going on. I believe there's 8 games going on this weekend over there, but we're not going to talk about those games in this video. I'll talk a bit about them, though, in my recap video next week. If you did not see last week, I did, of course, my bracket predictions. You can check that out. I'll link it in the description if you want to see it there. The bracket's not 100% accurate anymore, but it is still there if you're interested and want to see what I predicted back then. But enough about that. Let's go and let's jump into talking about the final 6 games of the 2023 regular season. We start with the first big pick game of the week, which is the New York Excelsior taking on the Vancouver Titans. It's an interesting matchup. Of course, last time these two teams played was in the spring stage. I want to say it was the final weekend of the spring stage, maybe the second to last weekend of the spring stage. 3-1 win for Vancouver. Neither of these teams particularly impressed me last week. New York, I thought, looked very bad against the LA Gladiators. Just not a meta I feel great about them in. Vancouver played against a very solid Toronto team. Took a map in that series on Flashpoint. So I think it's an interesting matchup here. I think this is what it really will be, kind of a storyline coming down to the strengths of these teams are pretty different. I think I look at this and I say, New York's a team that's not going to play Genji. They just don't really have a Genji player. Psycho doesn't really play it that much. We saw it a little bit, if I remember correctly, last week, and it wasn't incredible. Shockwave doesn't really play it, and we also don't see it from Fitz, so they don't really have a great flex DPS player for the meta that we're in right now. They don't have someone that you kind of trust on Genji in that way. I also don't love where they are if they have to put Fitz on Iliari. If they have Fitz over there, they don't really have a great damage lineup to do double hit scan. In the same vein, though, you're not going to get any hit scan really out of Vancouver. He's saying, and Sugarfree don't really play it, but their Genji play with Sugarfree is just phenomenal, that you can kind of get away with it. Neither of these teams look great in double flex support, though I think that we've seen a little more from Vancouver in that capacity. So I think it's an interesting matchup. These are two teams, I think, that we're seeing them in kind of not great spots for what they want to do, for what they're the most comfortable on. This match certainly has the potential to be interesting and somewhat close. I, however, don't really expect it to be all that close. I think New York has a chance to take a map in this series. I think they're good enough to potentially win a game, or to win like a map, maybe push them the distance, but to me, Vancouver's been the more consistent team. I think they've been just the better overall performer so far this year. So give me the Titans to win this one by a score of 3-0. It is a big pick game. I think the stakes are pretty high. It's a game that, depending on what we see, the version of each team that we see changes kind of what we get, you know, and how competitive a match it is. Obviously, this game is a lot of stakes for playoff implications and play-in implications if New York wins. I think no matter what, if they win, they are into the play-ins. And if they lose, it really comes down to what happens with Justice and Gladiators. They currently have the best differential of all of them. So the only way the Gladiators can pass them is if the Gladiators win and New York loses. So, you know, if the Gladiators lose, they're just out. So New York isn't out if they lose this game, but it certainly wouldn't hurt them. If they win, they definitely put themselves in a much better position. Even if they lose like 3-2, they might be safe, depending on what happens. But very, very intriguing matchup here. But I do think Vancouver should win this one. I think they look like they're in the better position right now. And so I have it going their way 3-1. Up next, we have the Boston Uprising taking on the Los Angeles Gladiators, who I just mentioned. It was a big weekend for them. This is my second big pick game of the weekend. Really, I have these two games, the big picks, because there is another game that has impact on playoff and play-in appearances, of course, with the Defiant versus Justice game, the final first game on Sunday. But to me, these two are the bigger ones because we'll know by the end of the Uprising versus Gladiators game the fate of the Gladiators, whether or not they're still alive or not. If they beat Boston, they're in a really, really, really good spot, potentially. I think if they beat Boston, they are in no matter what if New York loses to Vancouver. So we'll kind of know their fate depending on what happens there, and then that determines how much impact the Defiant and Justice games have. Really, it comes down to, if the Gladiators lose, then the Justice-Defiant game doesn't really mean anything because the Justice will be in. So this is why this one's the big game. It has the biggest kind of implications. There's the most going on there. And I think based on what we saw from the Gladiators this past weekend, I think they look very good. And I think this is a meta that could be very comfortable for this team. Genji, as long as Genji's meta the Gladiators, I think have a chance to win games. Boston do not feel comfortable on Genji at all. Decay is not a player that I would put in the comfort role when it comes to Genji. I think he's just better on other heroes. That's always been the case with him. He's always been more of a hit scan player. He plays Tracer, stuff like that. So Genji works very well for the Gladiators. Double flex support works pretty well for the Gladiators. They can put Cal in, they can put Babel, they can put Lasher, whoever there. But also, Lucio's been pretty good. Funny Astro was pretty impactful last week, which is good. Also, because of the way the meta is, you get to put Kai on hit scan heroes, which is good for him. So overall, this is a very good meta for Gladiators. I think it's a good meta for Boston in the sense of double flex support's good, double hit scan is pretty good, and you can play both of those things. And Smurf is a very solid Orisa player. So it's not a bad meta for Boston by any means, but Genji is a hero who on certain maps, especially like Flashpoint and other map types, you can find a lot of value on Genji. We saw how much value Kevster got in the series against New York. He was the player of the match in that game. He was absolutely dominant in that series because he's such a talented player. He's very good at the game. He has a very good sense of what he needs to do to kind of have a high impact. And so I think there's a chance that the Gladiators can take this game away. The problem is you're going up against a very, very good Boston team. A lot of really good players. Yes, they are not the best in terms of their overall record, but you look at their losses, right? They have 5 losses. 2 of those are to Florida. 2 of those are to Atlanta. And then they have a loss to Vancouver. So they've only lost to 3 teams this season. 4 if you include their loss in the Midseason Madness to the Houston Outlaws. So this is an Uprising team that has been, generally speaking, very dominant against the majority of the league. And as good as the Gladiators can be in this meta, I think it's very tough to expect them to win against a Boston Uprising team that overall has still been more consistent, has looked better, has been the stronger team, has been the stronger performer. So I am going to go in favor of the Boston Uprising. I am going to say that the Uprising do eliminate the LA Gladiators from the season with a win 3-0. I just think Boston is too good, like I said. I think the Gladiators, they have to essentially rely very, very heavily on Kevster to win. I think the Uprising have enough talent on their team and enough just game sense to understand how to play around that, how to stop that. I think that they have enough mechanical skill as well that I just think they're going to struggle to be able to kind of just hard rely on Kevster in this specific series. So I think Uprising take this one, like I said, 3-0 over the Gladiators. Up next is the Florida Mayhem taking on the Los Angeles Valiant. One of the surprising, kind of somewhat shockingly competitive games from earlier in the season. The first half of the season, these two teams played. It was like a decently competitive matchup. I think it was a 3-2 that went the way of the Mayhem. And I think Mayhem had to win the last 2 maps to win the series. It was a really good series. It was a phenomenal match. I remember watching the Avast co-stream for that one. And Albert was like, yeah, we're going to go pound the Valiant. And then the game was really, really close. And he came back afterwards. It was like, that should not have been that close. I think it won't be as close this time around. Obviously, the Valiant, they're out. They're not really playing for anything anymore. They're just kind of playing for fun at this point in time, right? They've been eliminated for a bit. what do you really have to gain? The Mayhem, they've already locked up their spot to Toronto, so kind of similar. What do you really have to gain? Obviously, they could potentially take the number 1 seed if they win and Atlanta loses. They're not going to pass Atlanta in differential if they both win. So they would need to win and the Reign would need to lose, which feels a little unlikely. So Mayhem seemingly are pretty much locked into the number 2 seed for the playoffs. So there's not really a ton on the line for them. So it could be a bit of a slip up, a bit of a game where they just kind of take the foot off the gas, just kind of do nothing too serious. You know, maybe they put Maka in full time just to get some reps there and see what they can do. I think it's absurd to think the Mayhem will lose this series. I think they're just simply the better team. They still are looking like one of the best teams in the world right now. They didn't have the most success in the midseason madness. I mean, they got third. They didn't make it to the finals, but they got third, which is good. They won the Pro-Am. They've been arguably the best team in the second half of the year. So Mayhem are certainly capable of finding success. Yes, Boston pushed them to 5, but Boston's a really good team, so it's not really anything to be worried about. So yeah, Florida Mayhem are going to win the series. It's going to be a one-sided 3-0 affair, I think. Not really much of a reason to expect it to be anything else. Mayhem are really, really good. Valiant, they have some good players, but overall, I don't think they have enough to take the win over the Florida Mayhem. Up next, we have the Toronto Defiant taking on the Washington Justice. Like I said, this game has playoff implications depending on what happens on Saturday. It also has Toronto midness implications, because if Toronto wins this series, I think, let me double check. Let me check the math. If Toronto wins this series by a score of 3-1, they will be 8-8 with a 0 differential, which is hilarious. And I would love to see that happen because it would be funny. So that's one of the storylines right now, one of the narratives going on right now. Potentially a chance we see the Defiant finish their season with a perfectly middle-of-the-pack record. They do look very good right now. This meta is very good for them. I think when you consider the ability to be able to put Surmajet in, really, really good looking on the Ilari so far, as well as getting Ultraviolet in a position that's comfortable where he can still play his flex support heroes. Getting Kaluj off Winston, which is always really good. And a pretty good DPS lineup for this meta. You can play the Echo if you want to. You can play the Genji as well, Spectra. I don't think it's his best hero necessarily, but something he certainly can play at a decently high level. And you get to put Hydron on a more kind of hard hit scan hero, which is definitely something he is very comfortable on. I really like where Toronto sits in this meta. I think they're in a lot of comfortable kind of roles. They get to kind of play to their strengths a lot more than they have in some of the previous metas. I think they might be right now the 5th best team in the Western region. We'll see what happens depending on in this play-ins. If the Gladiators get in, I do legitimately think there is a chance that Gladiators go for some kind of bizarro run where they could potentially get in. But I think it's unlikely because I right now think the Defiant look like just the team to beat outside of the Uprising in terms of the play-in team. So give me the Defiant to take this one. I'm going to say it's a score of 3-0. I don't think Washington is as good as Toronto or as Vancouver, who we just saw lose the series to Toronto. So I think it's pretty likely that the Defiant win this series as well. They're a better team. They've just been good, especially with the addition of Spectra. Obviously, not opener in this meta, but he's been pretty good as well. I just think when you look at where the Defiant are, they just look to be the better team here. I like a lot of what the Justice has done this year, but I don't think this is really a meta where their strengths have been highlighted. So, yeah, I think the Defiant walk away from this one victorious. Up next is the Houston Outlaws taking on the London Spitfire. Not one I expect to be particularly close. I think London's kind of second half of the season redemption arc getting to the play-ins after a very rough first half of the year is really interesting. I think it mirrors in many ways their successes from last year where they were just not great in stage 1 and then they really, really, really kind of got it all together in stage 2 and stage 3 and stage 4 and made it to the playoffs in a pretty solid way. I think that they're a team that they're very similar to what they were last year. Of course, the only real difference is now that they have Sauna on the team. I think that they really kind of figured out their identity once again, really the things that are the best for them, the things that work well for them, and they kind of played into that. And that's why they've managed to get in this position that they're in now. Houston is another creature, an entirely separate, beast that I think it'll be hard for London to overcome. Houston is still very, very good. Like I said, they are, I think, guaranteed the number 3 spot. I don't think they can jump up to the number 2 spot. I think they have guaranteed themselves the 3 spot. So there's literally nothing that Houston can really do and kind of prove in this game other than maybe get a little bit more comfortable in terms of just trying to learn this new meta a little bit more. Maybe you want to hide some stuff. Maybe you want to try to take it a little lighter and not reveal your kind of overall playoff potential plans. But I think that Houston should be favored to win this game pretty convincingly. To me, there really is that kind of the top 4 teams in the Western region, where outside of them, there's not really a ton of competition. I think that those teams are just kind of above and beyond, far and away better than the others. So I'm going to take Houston to win 3-0. London could take a map, especially something like Flashpoint, where I think depending on the map that you get, there's a little bit more potential for Reinhardt comps to do well. I think Rush is a very interesting map type, especially for Rush as a composition. I think that any map that you get where Reinhardt Rush is very good, there's always the possibility that London can take it. But I think Houston's a better team, so I think they're going to take this one because they should, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. Final match of the regular season is the Atlanta Reign taking on the San Francisco Shock. I believe it was the very first, or one of the very first big pick games of the season. Reign and Shock, they played in the opening weekend, and now they play again to close out the season. Such poetry. We love to see it. Very, very, very interesting matchup, if you consider where we thought these teams would be at the beginning of the season. We thought it'd be so much closer. We thought these would be 2 of the best teams in the league. We were right about one of them. We were not right about the other. Atlanta Reign should be heavily favored to win this series. They're the better team. They are still arguably the best team in the world. Them and Florida, both very, very good. 2 very solid, strong teams that really on any given day have the chance to do some real serious damage. But against the Shock, it's pretty clear that the Reign are the better team. I don't think this is the best meta for the Reign, obviously, but I still think you just look at the talent on this roster. They still are phenomenal. They still look comfortable pretty much everywhere. We saw Vigilante come in this past weekend, and he looked pretty good, getting to play the double flex metas. So I think Atlanta really should just be pretty heavily favored to win this one. I don't really think there's much reason to think that the Shock are able to win this series. Shock could definitely take a map, depending on what the map set is, depending on what kind of happens. Certainly room for it. They've definitely improved with some of the additions they made in the second half of the season, but I think that it really is going to be a pretty gargantuan task to beat the Reign in this one. So I'm going to take the Reign 3-0. They're the better team. It's not really much of a question. So give me the Reign to win the final match of the 2023 Overwatch League regular season. So there we go. Those are all of the picks. You can see them on the screen. You can also see my overall season record up until now. I always calculate it towards the end of the season. We're sitting right now at a nice 77.42% picks on the season. If that holds, that would be my best season pick rate to date, which is quite shocking, honestly. We'll see what happens this weekend, depending, on the results. That could go up or could go down, but very good. Big picks, 70% on the year so far. Much better from last year, where I was going 43%. I had a 75% in 2021. I think that's the best I've ever done. But 70% is pretty good. Overall, though, I've had a very good year with picks so far. So we'll see how hopefully we end strong and walk away from this weekend sitting very well with the picks. But that's all for today. That's all for this week. If you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Comment down below your thoughts on any of the matches I talked about today, the 2023 regular season, whatever it is you want to talk about. Obviously, award season's coming up, so I'll have some awards videos coming out when we get closer to the playoffs. But for now, that is it. So thank you all once again. I hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.